Animal Rights Academy is a free lecture series based in Toronto, Canada. On October 22, 2015, Dr. Kim Socha spoke to us at the University of Toronto. Her topic? On Atheism and Animals. Kim Socha is a community college professor, animal advocate, and social justice activist. She joined us via Skype from her home in Minnesota. She is an English professor at Normandale Community College in Bloomingdale. She has published on topics such as atheism, critical animal studies, veganism, feminism, and radical pedagogy. Today she will be drawing issues from her latest book, Animal Liberation and Atheism, Dismantling the Procrustean Bed.
Well, first I want to thank everybody for attending. I want to thank Paul York for inviting me and for all the organizers, Carlos for working with me with the technology. I'm very proud and happy to present on a vegan atheology, the failure of religion, the promise of atheism. And I look forward to any questions that arise after I give my talk. So I first want to explain what I mean by vegan atheology, and this is something that I actually don't do in the book, but somebody asked me subsequently in an interview, so I think it bears some definition. So I first want to start with theology, which most understand as the study of God. I'm using a very Christian Western perspective here, because that's the perspective I grew up on, but I do address other religions in this presentation. So God, his plans for humans on earth, and how humans should understand and act within the universe in light of God's relations with us and revelations to us. So that's theology. And I was introduced to the term atheology in a book I recommend, Michel Onfray's Atheist Manifesto. And atheology literally means without or in opposition to theology. So taking the without part, atheology is an attempt through science and philosophy to understand and learn how to act within the universe through non-supernatural means. As far as in opposition to, atheology seeks to expose the damage that often lies in the wake of religious texts, traditions, and authorities, while offering alternatives to those oppressive customs. So for example, I consider neuroscientist Sam Harris's The Moral Landscape, How Science Can Determine Human Values, which some people may have read, to be an atheological text, albeit a speciesist one, which I'm going to talk about. And that's of the without and in opposition to variety of atheology. So I'm not a scientist, I'm not a hard scientist, I'm not a soft scientist, I'm a humanities person. So I consider my book, Animal Liberation and Atheism, to be more of an in opposition to atheological text, but one seeking to expose the theological thinking that subversively motivates some of our culture's premier atheologists. This is my book that was published on October 14th. So I want to just talk a little bit about the subtitle and why I wrote this book. Anyone who's interested in Greek mythology might already know this, but I'll explain, because it's actually the most frequently asked question I get in interviews or talks. So what is a Procrustean bed? There's a character from Greek mythology named Procrustes, and he lived at the gates of Hades, and he was a pretty nasty guy. He would drag wayfarers into his inn and fit them to his bed. So if somebody was too long for the bed, he would chop off their limbs. If someone was too short, he would stretch them out on a rack. And if anyone ever fit his bed perfectly, he actually had another bed that he would just kind of slide them into and hack away or do whatever he does. And basically what that term has come to mean, a Procrustean bed, is whenever you try to make something fit where it doesn't. So it's kind of like putting the square peg into the round hole. So what I'm saying is, I'm going to dismantle the Procrustean bed, which are religious arguments for animal liberation. I want to give some caveats. There are dangers in speaking of any religion as a holistic entity. There are sects, there are different ideas. It's impossible to talk about one Christianity or one Buddhism or even one Wicca. People practice differently. But I only have a short amount of time. So, as I do in the book, and I will in this presentation even more, I'm going to have to paint some things in broad strokes. am, in this presentation, going to focus primarily on Western religion, mainly Christianity, with some commentary on Eastern traditions. In my book, I also write about monotheistic religions such as Judaism and Islam, as well as indigenous and pagan practices. But again, the main focus is what I know best, which is the Christian world that I was raised in, so that's where my focus is going to be. Why did I want to write this book? Because it seems there is a disparity between animal activists' religious orientations and the predominance of literature that proposes religious arguments for animal liberation. So as I explain in the book, study after study by sociologists has shown that the animal rights movement, with some notable exceptions, is predominantly secular. So it's comprised of people who call themselves atheists or agnostics or a-religious, or they simply don't care, or they're free thinkers. And I cite those studies making that connection. So this is, in a sense, a secular movement. This disparity is somewhat similar to the often noted overwhelming majority of women in the animal rights movement. About 80% is the last statistic I heard. So they are the rank and file activists. Women are, but the theoretical voice and organizational leadership is quite often still highly male. Well, as predominantly secularists, why are the arguments from religious perspectives being dominated by the religious? What about making an argument from religious perspective that is from an atheist, which is how I identified? I'm not pretending that I reinvented the wheel here. There are many secularists writing animal liberation theory, many of them, one of whom I cite herein, Joan Dunnier, and I'm sure others I cite. However, they're not directly connecting their atheism, agnosticism, or humanism to animal rights in a way that I wanted to see. Like, I was waiting for that book. In contrast, religious texts do. So you'll have Christianity and animal rights, or Buddhism and animal rights, or animal liberation. But I have yet to see this book that I wanted, called Atheism and Animal Liberation, or Animal Liberation and Atheism. So I decided to write it. As in many other situations, when religious cases are made for ideas that religious texts and traditions do not support, and writers will apply secular reasoning to religious ideologies. So my supposition is, let's skip the religious part and consider how animals fare once religion is removed as a lens for viewing non-human animals. I need to mention what I mean by animal liberation, because if we're talking about animal welfare or more compassion towards animals, then I think religion does absolutely have a place. I'm not saying it's completely worthless. But how I define animal liberation, it's not like a storming of the Bastille type situation. Rather, it's a process, sometimes a glacial process, by which non-human animals are deemed by human animals to exist for purposes other than human ends. Animal liberation is not about a day in which all the cage doors are going to be opened. Rather, I see it as an enlightenment period through which human animals see non-humans differently in a non-supremacist way. There are some examples through history to show that these changes happen. There are other examples that show we're headed in the wrong direction. One example that I think is promising but also frustrating, because I do anti-vivisection activism, is if you look at the history of medical and scientific experimentation, there was a time when it was considered by some to be an unarguable fact that people of color did not feel pain. And I cite some of this old research in the book, that they don't feel pain the way white people do. One doctor actually says you could cut off a Negro's limbs and they will just kind of sleep right through it. And we could say, who thinks that way anymore? But up to the 1970s, we have the Tuskegee experiments, when, again, we have black men being used in a syphilis study of which they had no knowledge. So I don't like making trans-species analogies too often, but we see this kind of bar moving in who gets counted in the moral community. Animals are being considered more, but unfortunately it doesn't always mean less death for them in certain industries. So why is religion insufficient to answering the animal question? So why is it incapable? I'm going to offer 3 concepts, which probably won't be new to people, but I use definitions that I like. So Joan Dunnier wrote a book called Speciesism, and it's a failure in attitude or practice to accord any non-human being equal consideration and respect. So there's different definitions, but I think people have a general sense. It's like other types of ism. You exist in a certain type of body, so you're less than this other group that looks different than you. Anthropocentrism is the belief that human beings are the central, most important species on the planet. A less well-known term is anthropomonism, which is the belief that human beings are the only species on the planet that matters. I don't think we're there yet, but religion is inherently about humans trying to find their place in the world and the myths that they create around that. So it's inherently about the human condition. And then hierarchy. I'm using Riane Eisler's definition of domination hierarchy, and that's different than types of hierarchies. It's a system of human ranking based on force or threat of force. Domination hierarchies characteristically inhibit the actualization of higher functions, not only in the social system, but also in the individual human. And of course, this is a very speciesist definition, but when you think of domination hierarchies, who's important and who isn't, you could see that non-human animals, that definitely applies to them as well. So I'm moving on to the next slide. It's two images, hierarchy and Western religion. I'm starting with Western religion, but for any philosophy folks out there, this definitely precedes Christianity. The yellow image comes from Plato and the Great Chain of Being, and although the Christians had much that was not in common with the ancient Greeks, they readily adopted this hierarchy, where it's based on who has right. So you can look at this religious view of the world, the realm of being, realm of becoming, and non-being. So we can see this view of the world, and we can see, let's take out the angels and demons just for a moment. If you just deal with man, woman, and animals, we can see how historically that ranking has played out. That's certainly not an argument anyone's ever made that there is no hierarchy or oppression. And then I wanted just to note there are further historical divisions. So in the Great Chain of Being, we have man, and this is even a simplification. Man is broken down into there's white men, and then there's black, brown, yellow, whatever color. The same with women. There's white women, and then there's women who are not white. So everything, again, is being compared to the ideal, which is white. I mean, even today in 2015, we have a social justice movement called Black Lives Matter. There's still a need to remind people of what we would hope would have been a given truth by this point. So again, in the real world, let's take out the religious aspect. We have man serves God, woman serves man, people of color serve whites, and animals serve all. So that's a real simplification of history, but it's kind of the view of the world that I was raised with, and I know that many in the Western world have been as well. So I want to consider what I take as a given at this point, but I realize everybody might not. So I pose the question on this next slide, why do non-human animals matter? Why should we care? And just as an aside, I do address plants. I would be foolish to say plants are not alive and deserve to be respected. I don't believe they are sentient, nevertheless. I'm willing to be proven wrong. But this is why non-human animals matter, because of course I believe humans are animals as well. So what is sentience? Again, a term you might be familiar with. Sentient creatures are those who have feelings, both physical and emotional, and whose feelings matter to them. I just love the beautiful simplicity of that definition by De Silva. They have feelings, and those feelings matter. One of the biggest boosts to the concept of animal sentience and consciousness actually came in July 2012 when a group of internationally respected neuroscientists presided over by Stephen Hawking developed the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness at the Francis Crick Memorial Conference. So I'll just read this passage to you, although it's on the screen. Some of this is going to seem like, wow, it took neuroscientists to figure this out. It seems kind of evident to anyone who's interacted with certain species of animal, but they came to this conclusion that convergent evidence indicates that non-human animals have the neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrates of conscious states, along with the capacity to exhibit intentional behaviors. Consequently, the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique, that's my emphasis, in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Non-human animals, including all mammals and birds, and many other creatures, including octopuses, also possess these neurological substrates. So they did leave out fish and insects, but this was, I think, a very important moment to give credence to this idea of consciousness and sentience. It's not just animal rights activists, let's say, who are making these claims. No one anymore denies that animals are capable of feeling pain, but there is a sense that they lack consciousness, because the term I've heard used by biologists is they don't see their lives in a biological sense. So they don't see it unfolding as a narrative. I don't find that reason enough to use them as we please. So in response to the great chain of being, I want to undo all of Western thought and offer you a spectrum of being where all of the supernatural is taken out, and we have the grouping of conscious sentient animals, plants, and minerals, and those little dots just show how wonderfully complex life is, because there are those living beings who fall somewhere very low on the consciousness level. For example, arguments can be made that mussels or bivalves have less consciousness than plants, or insects weren't included. I want to talk a bit about Eastern religion. One of my readers, one of my peer reviewers, and the gentleman who wrote the afterword to my book is Dr. Scott Hurley. He is a religious studies scholar at Luther College. I just want to give him a shout out because he was so helpful to me as I navigated religion. And I should say that as an atheist, I have formally studied Buddhism at a Zen temple. But again, the Buddhism that I studied was an atheistic Buddhism, which is not the case. Some people say Buddhism is not atheistic. So there go the broad strokes again. Eastern religions are often seen as being more animal-friendly, and some of them are, absolutely. Can't deny it when compared to the Abrahamic traditions. However, they are still speciesist, anthropocentric, and hierarchical. In fact, after my research, I'm prepared to argue that Eastern religions are misunderstood by many in terms of their positions on non-human animals. Here we have the Buddhist wheel of life. I'm going to talk about some terms associated with Buddhism. So we see a very clear distinction. It's not like the great chain of being, because of course in Buddhism, again, not all Buddhists and Hindus believe in this, but there's a belief among some in rebirth and reincarnation. So we see a very distinct break between the human realm and the animal realm. I'm probably going to say this incorrectly, but in one of the most animal-friendly religious texts I ever read, the Lakravana Sutra, and I'm probably messing up that name, it was written 700 years after the historical Buddha had died. But in that book, Buddha is saying, I am unequivocally stating you are not to eat meat. It's aberrant to do. It still didn't become a core tenet of Buddhism. So Buddhism is not a vegetarian or vegan religion. And again, we see that clear distinction. If you live a bad life, you're reborn as an animal. And even in that text I mentioned that is the most animal-friendly, it clearly states that one reason not to eat animals is it might cause you to be reborn as one, and that is a lower birth. The historical Buddha permitted meat eating as long as the animal eaten was not slaughtered for the specific person eating the animal's flesh. So that was a long time ago, before Christ. But this idea of not having an animal specifically slaughtered for you fully sanctions about 99% of the situations in which people eat meat in the United States today. And so that's why I think that Eastern religions are better, but I think for animals they're still not enough. As far as karma goes, just the idea you get back what you put out. So if one chooses not to eat non-human animals to avoid absorbing the fear and terror the animals felt before slaughter, which is one of the reasons, That is better for animals, but it still does not change the perception of animals as beings with an innate right to bodily integrity. In fact, animals are tacitly acknowledged as lower beings whose use or non-use can lead to higher states of consciousness. Living in delusion and idiocy, those are two terms that are in quotes from someone else, as a human will lead to rebirth within the non-human animal realm. So there's this idea of, is karma a selfish act? Is it all about the human? Regardless of what the answer is, and I have actually read research by Buddhists who are extremely frustrated, the major leaders in Buddhism, from monks to the Dalai Lama, are not vegetarian. I think the Dalai Lama was at one time and then started eating meat again. And the Dalai Lama, let's remember, is the embodiment of Buddha nature. If the embodiment of Buddha nature says it's acceptable to eat other animals, that is making a statement about their worth. And again, just I want to note samsara. It's the cycle of births and rebirths. So if you look at that wheel, those are the different realms that you can fall into. And non-human births are the lower birth. And now I'm going to the slide on Jainism, and I call it the misunderstood religion. I have always been fascinated with it because it seemed nothing could be wrong with Jainism. It's a very small community of people overall when compared to Christianity and Islam and even Buddhism. So the Jains are a sect of Hinduism, and they are so cautious of not killing, not taking life, that they will often wear coverings over their faces so they don't swallow bugs or organisms even smaller than bugs. They'll sweep where they walk so they don't step on bugs. Some Jains will starve to death in a bid to reach a higher state. Some Jains don't engage in intercourse because it kills sperm. So this is just really wow, of course that's not very practical and not indicative of all Jains. And Mahavir, one of the early Jain proponents, is a very interesting man to study. He had wonderful things to say about women, about the caste system, about the universe, about the environment. But again, Jainism is not vegan. Surprisingly, from what I said, is not a vegan religion. So I want to give some examples of speciesism, anthropocentrism, and hierarchy that I came across when I was studying Jainism. The Jains have a very rigid taxonomy of births, where it's more based on the senses. The more senses you have, the higher you are. And one of the senses is consciousness, so humans are the highest. Again, it's very much like the Wheel of Life and the Great Chain of Being. So this is a quote from Christopher Chappell. He is a religious studies scholar, and I think he puts it very well. Jainism, with few exceptions, avoids sentimentalizing animals. Ultimately, the reason one respects animals is not for the sake of the animal, but for the purpose of lightening the karmic burden that obscures the splendor of one's own soul. So again, think about what I had said earlier about Buddhism and karma and samsara. Yes, less animals may die, but it's not necessarily because the animals are worthwhile in their own right. It all comes back to the humans. We are humans, we are the center of the earth, we are the highest birth, and it remains anthropocentric. When we get to this idea of karma and samsara, some really interesting and disturbing things can start to happen with how the world is viewed. For example, non-humans who suffer in zoos, slaughterhouses, and research labs, there's this idea that they've brought the misery upon themselves because of misdeeds in their former lives. Thus, there is no necessity in Jainism to actively assist other species. So, again, I'm not saying there's no Jains who wouldn't rescue a suffering animal, but I read an interview with a Jain practitioner who explains if an animal is suffering, then they've brought it upon themselves and they will be reborn. And I think that's a very dangerous way to look at the world, because it definitely does not lend itself to activism of any kind, to challenging. When you look at, they're going to get another chance, they're going to be reborn, I think it leads to stasis. Another example is because of this very extreme idea of not taking life, in some cases, animals in severe pain, the belief is they should not be euthanized because that would be taking life. And I'm of the mind, I believe that any being in severe pain should not be forced to live through that. So that's some of the issues with Jainism. Definitely a nice alternative, I think, to the Western traditions, but we see these same examples at play. And that's because I think religion was invented by humans. So I want to talk about the promise of atheism and then the problem with atheism. And atheism simply means a disbelief in God. Or just like there's no one Christianity, there's also not one atheism that, like, this is how all atheists think. So I want to look at some of the promise, some of the hopeful things. And I'm going to start with a man who's not very well liked by some, he has a lot to say. I have some problems with him as well, for sure. So Richard Dawkins wrote an essay called Gaps in the Mind, which was in a collection co-edited by Peter Singer about apes, the Great Ape Project. And I just love this quote. So Dawkins says, "What's so special about humans? The speciesist assumption that lurks here is very simple. Humans are humans and gorillas are animals. There is an unquestioned yawning gulf between them, such that the life of a single human child is worth more than the lives of all the gorillas in the world. Tie the label Homo sapiens to even a tiny piece of insensible embryonic tissue, and its life suddenly leaps to infinite, uncomputable value. But the melancholy fact is that, at present, society's moral attitudes rest almost entirely on the discontinuous speciesist imperative." So here is this really brilliant statement about speciesism, about human supremacy, and Dawkins has been called to task by people who attend his talks, by Peter Singer, who's not without his own issues. He knows all of the reasons that he should be vegan, let's say, and he gives really bad excuses for why he isn't. Same with Sam Harris. He states in his book, The Moral Landscape, that factory farms are ethically indefensible, yet he still eats from them, although that might be changing. Just recently, he was on the lookout for information on vegan nutrition, so Sam Harris might be going vegan. Because this is the conclusion that these four horsemen of atheism are coming to, but they're not following through on their own ethical conclusions. And that's the promise. So that their ethical conclusions lead in the Western world, or to worlds where it is possible to live without eating animals. It all points towards veganism, towards eliminating animals from our diets and our research and our clothing and our entertainment, but they don't act upon their own ethics. They're in good company because some of the earliest Western philosophers, such as Jeremy Bentham and John Locke, I mean, there were exceptions, they did the same thing. They would argue for animal rights up to the point that they would consider not eating meat anymore, and at that point they stopped. I did not expect to find what I did in the work of these atheist scholars and celebrities, and I got so frustrated that Dawkins and Harris, and even Hitchens to a certain extent, in his book, God is Not Great, the late Christopher Hitchens, he has a whole chapter on how horribly pigs have been treated because of religion. So he has enough thought that he's going to write a whole chapter on how pigs are eaten, but from what I know, he never gave up eating pigs in his own life, and that's a problem. Not following through on your own ethical conclusions is a problem. So now with that, I'm at the problem with atheism. And I'm going to pose this as a question and answer. The question I'm posing is, secular activists, again, activists, not all secular people. There are horrible humans who are atheists and agnostic and everything. I'm talking about people who see religion as a harm and try to fight those harms. Secular activists see sexism, racism, nationalism, etc. as vestiges of religious domination. My question is, so why are animal liberation issues generally ignored by those in the secular community? And I actually think I found an answer, again, getting us back to this Western way of thinking, in the Atheist Manifesto by Michel Onfray, which I had mentioned to you. And this is a quote from Onfray's book. "Secular thought is not de-Christianized thought, but immanent Christian thought. Couched in rational language, it nevertheless preserves the quintessence of the Judeo-Christian ethic. Let's say you were raised religious like I was, and I became atheist. I didn't somehow shake off all of the belief systems, the viewpoints, the worldviews that forced me to be Catholic and kept me Catholic for probably the first 18 to 20 years of my life. I didn't just shake all of that off, and my Catholicism is always with me. I have to fight some of the things that it tells me about the world sometimes. Even if you're raised atheist, let's say, which some people are, you are not raised in an atheist culture, and religion determines your worldview. As much as I would like to think that I was above it and beyond it, of course that's not the case. It's not how the human brain works. Issues of speciesism, anthropocentrism, and hierarchy, I argue, are part of that quintessence that Frank mentions. Some may be post-God, but they are not post-religion. Or more correctly, I should say, they may be post-God, but they're not post-religious thought. A core of that worldview is anthropocentrism, is human supremacy. Humans matter more than other species. Not just a little bit, but a whole lot, to the extent that 70 million land animals killed per year to feed people in the Western world. Untold number of animals used in research labs, because mice and rats don't get counted when the numbers come in about what animals are used. So we clearly have not just human supremacism, but like human supremacism gone wild, unchecked, human mastery. So the question that I want to end with is, what can atheism bring to the table for non-humans? Or what can it take away from the table, meaning animal products? I really want to emphasize that I'm not saying that all atheists do think this way, but I think that many of the atheist luminaries, the people who the activist atheists look up to, are coming to conclusions that need to be attended to, that need to be followed and understood. So what can atheism do for non-humans? It includes the acknowledgement that humans are an animal species, not divine in any way. So not chosen. This idea of being chosen is a very dangerous idea. It includes a rejection of supposedly sacred texts and practices that are inherently speciesist, hierarchical, and anthropocentric. This allows for moral progress that does not seek sanction of higher authorities. So, for example, if somebody is Christian and they want to make an argument for animal liberation, not animal welfare, not more compassion for animals, they would be hard-pressed to find anything in the text of Christianity, which is the Bible, that will support the idea that non-human animals are even close to the same level of humans. Atheism focuses on lived realities, not past or future paradises or rebirths. Many people don't live in this one world. They're thinking, keep people oppressed and promise them that there will be a paradise waiting for them at the end. The poor will go to heaven, the meek will go to heaven, and meanwhile they suffer on earth. I think some of the perspectives of the religions that I've mentioned do not allow people to focus on the lived realities of other species. So I'm not going to wait for a rebirth or for a paradise for an animal who is suffering. They need to be helped now because they're suffering now. And it argues for a questioning of cultural norms that spring from religious traditions and thinking. And of course, these questions also come from religion, from extremely progressive facets of religion. They just tack on secular thinking to some of the horrible things the religion says about slavery, women's rights, LGBTQIA rights, treatment of people with disabilities, and the list goes on and on. So, just as a final statement before we go to questions, my ultimate argument is that atheism, freedom from God and religion, offers the most hope for ethical consideration of non-human animals. Secularism, not religion, can help the human animal inch ever closer to a post-speciesist world, which would greatly benefit the non-human animal species that humans exploit and slaughter in incalculable numbers. However, much work needs to be done in that area, in building an atheology, that integrates non-humans into the fold of those persons who deserve moral consideration and are not merely means to another's end. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. I'm going to turn on my camera.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's funny to present when I just see a PowerPoint, because I don't know, I'm like, are they still there? So I'm open to any questions.
Hi, Kim.
I remember you.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah, from the ICAST conference.
Yeah, I'm glad you remember me. Thanks.
Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I thought it was great to hear you speak tonight. Thank you so much for offering to do this, and I thought you did a really good job going over many of the problems with animal rights and traditional religions. Since I study religion, your talk was particularly interesting to me. Although, traditional religions definitely have an influence. I think Max Weber's argument about Protestantism and capitalism is very convincing. When I took a course on atheism at U of T, when we were reading Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion, there was a passage when the folly of this idea of final causes, the intelligent design argument, is being discussed, where the use of animals by human beings, the idea that the animals were put on the earth for human beings to use them and that they're designed to be used by human beings, is used as an example of the folly of religion. So I think that there's definitely a history with some of the really influential atheist philosophers during the Enlightenment, and so I think that's all very convincing, but at the same time, 85% of the human beings on Earth ascribe to some kind of religion, and since religion is something that's so much at the core of many people's existence, you can't expect people to just give up their entire belief system. So I think there is value in trying to make these arguments for animal rights from traditional religions. So that was the things I'd like you to address. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you. I wanted to address a very valid point where you said 85% of people identify with a particular religion.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, of course. That's why animals are not being, treated. But that's kind of a glib answer. And I really think that religion, and I've stated this before, I think religion can be a very vibrant avenue for integrating different perceptions of animals, and I want to just recommend two, Matthew Scully's Dominion and Andrew Lindsay's The God of All Creatures, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
I think that what I love about those two books and those two authors is that they admit there's problems and that there are gaps that religion isn't answering, but we are going to find ways, like liberation theology,
exactly.
or progressive revelation. And I think they do it in such an honest way that those arguments, for kind of the die-hard Christian, I think that those arguments can really lead to new conceptions of other species.
For sure.
Yeah. I do believe, aside from animal treatment, I think religion, again, is inherently an oppressive tool. I think anything can be reimagined. And I think it's definitely up to those who represent those ideologies to do the reimagining as well. So I think those books are good. I didn't find them satisfactory to answering to how this is, I guess, the greediness or joy of being an author is I got to define what animal liberation is.
Yeah.
But I do see them as hope that it is possible, and I think they demonstrate that yes, religion can be used positively. I just wish more people who were religious would do that.
Absolutely. I think you addressed this a little bit when you talked about the reimagining and it being up to the people who have inherited these traditions to do the reimagining, which I think is a great point, and I agree with that. But this increasing view of the world as a machine that we get during the Industrial Revolution and as a consequence of the Scientific Revolution, where there's this purging of the natural world, and also that would include women and people of color and so on, anyone who's associated with nature, this purging of the natural world of any kind of soul, of any kind of sentience. The ecofeminist philosopher Carolyn Merchant talks a lot about that, and so do Horkheimer and Adorno in Dialectic of Enlightenment. They talk about the disenchantment of the world being the extirpation of animism. And although I agree with all the points you made, the one thing that gets me when it comes to animal rights and religion is that it seems to me that religions could have a role to play in re-enchanting the world, as Zipporah Weisberg, who's done a lot of work on the Frankfurt School and animals, would say. And traditional religions, even though they've been responsible for a lot of misery of animals and also women and other minorities, they do depict animals as having souls, as being spiritual beings, and I think that in an age in which we see animals as commodities, that could be a valuable mindset to go back to. I'm an artist, and in my art I like to depict animals with religious iconography for that reason. It resonates with me. So I would really like it if you could address that.
It's a really valid point, and I think it is very much connected to your first question. I mean, my thought is that, of course, that atheism is what brings those different views of animals into play.
Yeah.
I'm very critical of the idea of the soul, because it's always going to be humans who get to decide who has a soul or doesn't have a soul. I can't imagine a point at which, I mean, maybe someday, and again, this glacial process, that would be my concern, that I think atheism, like one of the points I ended on, this idea of one life, of a single life, I think causes me, at least, but again, I'm just one atheist, causes me to value the world I live in so much more.
Yeah.
And you have a very valid point as well, in that, many of the atheists I mentioned in this presentation, that I mentioned in my book, are scientists. They use the scientific method, empirical evidence. The neuroscientists I mentioned in the Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness, they did almost all of their research in laboratories and not in the wild, just to come to the conclusion that animals are conscious. Like, I think everyone in this room would have come to that same conclusion, because you see the world. So that's a major. So I think you identified, though, a major problem as well with atheism. But I think this idea of restoring life to the life world, to see those, I find that resides most in giving up the idea of afterlives and souls, and that there's only the here and now, and we should all get to live it as close to our idea of joy as possible.
That's very profound.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for addressing that.
Thanks, it was nice to see you again.
You too.
I did want to ask you, I taught a course on animals and religion last year, and our main text was by a thinker named Paul Waldo.
I'm familiar with his work. I use it in my book, but more his specter of speciesism.
Yes, right, because that's the one that's critical of Buddhism and Christianity. What I liked about in that book and in his other writings was that he examined the texts from a pro-animal point of view, and he was showing that there was an element of speciesism in those traditions. What it seemed to me, though, is that there was also this element of interpretation that one can bring to texts. So it's not like the texts are fixed. You can bring interpretation to them, and that's where somebody like Andrew Lindsay comes in, where he's reinterpreting Christian scriptures in a pro-animal way. One of the problems with atheism that we find a lot, with our simplistic versions of it anyway, they're based on a literalist interpretation of the scriptures. This is what the scripture says, this is the dominant way in which it's interpreted, but then we can see at the same time that there's multiple interpretations that are possible. Well, even Paul Waldo's work, while it was very critical of speciesism in the text, was open to the possibility of a pro-animal interpretation of those texts. So you have something like kosher being redefined within the Jewish tradition as being vegan, as opposed to just the method for cutting a cow's neck. And that's a really positive avenue for Jews who might want to interpret their tradition in a way that honors or respects animals in creation and is pro-environmental.
And it's a really good point, so thank you for asking. I came across this a lot in the the works I read a lot of religious arguments for animal rights. Like, I wanted to know my stuff. And, I mean, clearly an argument can be made that, from the Christian Bible, that God's ideal for life on earth is a world where there is no killing for food, the lion lays with the lamb, paradise, sinning was associated with eating animal flesh, which was nicely emphasized in the movie that was just okay, Noah, if anybody saw that movie.
Yeah, that was a great movie.
Yeah, it was, and I'm like, yes, this is pro-vegan. So yeah, I think those elements are there. I mean, and even in the Quran, there's I think a beautiful passage, and I'm going to do a horrible job of paraphrasing it, but it's that the end of time, all will be counted, and all animals, they signify nations of beings, and everyone gets counted at the end. There are those promising passages, however, a statement such as, animals will live in fear of you. You are in, whether it's dominion or stewardship or whatever the interpretation, because I know the word is interpreted differently. I wonder, well, how do we interpret that in an animal-friendly way?
Well, some passages clearly can't be interpreted in animal-friendly, and I think the Enlightenment perspective would be to just, like, the Jefferson Bible, in which he expunged a lot of the elements he didn't like from the Bible.
Yeah, he took that all the supernatural, like anything that was related at all to the supernatural.
Yeah, so let's call that the Jefferson Bible approach, or the Kantian approach, which is to get rid of passages that can't possibly be interpreted in any good way. And so it requires sort of a hermeneutics where you come at the scripture outside of the tradition and judge it according to a kind of a secular ethics. This part's good, that part isn't good. I think that's what Waldo is trying to do, and I kind of agree with him, Kim, but what I also like is that, he didn't entirely reject religion out of hand. He was more nuanced than the writer James Rachels, who's sort of like Freud, because he took only the monotheistic Judeo-Christian tradition in its simplest form, and he didn't allow for the complexities and nuances outside of those traditions. And he made a really great point, but he built up a straw man of religion that was devoid of its complexities and its internal contradictions, and then that way it was easier to tear it down. So anyway, I don't know if you have a response to that.
I guess my question would be, well, who has the authority then to go in and decide what should be there and what shouldn't be there? Do we all make our individual books, and the meat eater's going to find I bet if I took the time, I could develop like a vegan Bible based on what's in the book. So when it gets to that amount of, and I actually say this in the book because I really do, I look at what the religious authors are saying, even religious authors who I really admire their work, like Lindsay and Scully, and some of the eco-feminists as well. I mean, it's like, if you have to get this creative, and you have to cut this much out, and you can't answer for this, and this is a problem, is it maybe you're looking in the wrong place? So the idea that we can all make religion, we can all make, let's say, the Bible or the Quran or any sacred text, what we want it to be, which I think is the problem.
That's a good point, yeah. The practical argument for the continued use of religions to emphasize ethical points is that they represent widely shared symbolic representations of moral issues. The double-edged sword that they represent is that they can be used in the worst possible way, which we see all around us. But the positive view of them is this idea of shared representations, and this is a Kantian idea, that they're practically useful in order to share narratives in a way that secular ethics isn't. Secular ethics is very awkward in its language, and it seems like the human brain is wired towards symbol, myth, and narrative, and not towards understanding things in a more abstract ethical sense. I'm sure you've run across that idea before, right? I don't know.
Yeah, and I really agree with you, and I should specify that I don't classify myself as a new atheist. So I'm not, it might not sound like it, but I'm not as antagonistic towards religion as it might sound. And I actually agree with everything you said. I would never want to get rid of the Bible or the Quran, just like I don't want to get rid of Greek mythology or Scandinavian mythology or Egyptian mythology. These are all narratives of the human condition, of human evolution. I just want to see religion, Christianity, Islam, anything, become these really rich, interesting myths. And we can still, I think there's absolutely room for that in an atheist view of the world.
I agree with you 100%. And they have to be recognized not as the absolute word of God, not to be questioned, but rather as human expressions of the human condition, as you put it.
And also to be contextualized. I mean, there's nothing that frustrates me more than, hatred against people who are not heteronormative based on one or two passages from the Bible that are not properly contextualized. The passage from the Quran that I mentioned, it gives me chills when I read it because it's beautiful, but I kind of look at it, and this is something that actually came up as a dilemma at the college where I work, where a teacher was teaching a course on myth, and he chose to use the Bible as one of the course texts. And some students got really upset by that. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if the world is ready for that.
No, I mean,
but I don't want to dismiss these books. I don't want to dismiss them. I don't want to get rid of them.
No, because what we've seen is the rise of fundamentalist type religions, emphasizing biblical or Quranic literalism and willing to back it up with violence. The secularization theory that was popular in the early 20th century that we would be moving progressively towards.
Yeah, it's not happening.
It's not happening. It's actually the opposite. So I am glad that you've addressed animals and religion. I mean, one of the arguments in defense of carnism is that has to be sort of dismantled. But there's something called the functional definition of religion. And according to that, it's a sociological term, which means defining religion according to the social function that it serves rather than based on orthodox belief or correct belief. So by that definition, that really expands the definition to include things like carnism or animal rights. Now, some people who are atheists say, animal rights is not a religion. Personally, I've never seen the problem in defining it as such, according to that functional definition. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me you're not really defining religion that way. You're defining it more in what's called an essentialist definition, which is a certain set of beliefs and practices that we understand generally to be religion, right?
Yeah, definitely. And it's funny you mentioned that. I have a whole section of the book about not using religious terminology in the animal advocacy or veganism movements. First of all, a great argument can be made that veganism and animal rights is a secular religion.
Right.
I did a lot of interdisciplinary work, so I looked at the work of anthropologists and sociologists, and I could not argue that that argument, it can very strongly be made. But ultimately, my conclusion is that it shouldn't be looked at as a religion. I would rather have us have people who think about these things look at this idea of ethical models, because religion, there are certain words and certain ideas which I think just at this point it's too hard or not worth the time to extricate them from all of the baggage that they come with.
I see what you mean, and so that's often the way in which animal rights as a religion is used in a kind of pejorative way to dismiss it.
Oh, absolutely. It's a cult, actually, yeah.
Yeah, it's like it's a cult, so I see the point there. Yeah, ethical models, that's good, I like that. Yeah, thanks for answering my questions and doing the talk, too, as well.
Thanks for the great questions.
Yeah, so let's see if anybody else wants to get in here.
Hi, my name's Paul. I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm pleased that your Catholic upbringing gave you the tools to reject it. That's your choice. My question is sort of, when I think of theism and atheism, I think of opposites. And when I think of, the mysteries of consciousness in the universe, I think, how could I commit to one or the other, really? I mean, positing the non-existence of something beyond us, it takes a certain amount of confidence to do that, and where do you get that confidence?
I guess the thing is I really, I don't, I think what I've often, I like the term atheist because for me it means I don't have a God. I am without God. My life does not include that element. But I am completely open to, what do I know?
Well, that sounds like agnosticism to me.
Yeah.
What's that?
Sounds like agnosticism to me.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I mean about the broad strokes, that you can't define things in one way. Atheism really, literally means without God. And I am a human being who is without a God in my life. But I think even atheist extraordinaire Richard Dawkins, in The God Delusion, has a chapter where in his scientific way he goes about proving, while there almost certainly is not a God, I simply don't know. And I see no reason, as far as my goals and my personal ethics, to have a God in my life. So atheism, as I define it for myself, is literally without God. But I think there's so much that we don't understand and can't comprehend. And I am open and always excited to learn. I'm working my way through the show Cosmos on Netflix because I just, which I'm sure many of you have seen. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear, that's how I define atheism.
Thank you. I like your definition very much. It's kind of similar to my own worldview, though I was raised a Christian. Actually, my father was a minister, but he was in a very liberal church. What I wanted to suggest maybe is that there's multiple atheisms.
Just like multiple Christianity.
Exactly. And what you're describing maybe could be called spiritual agnostic atheism or something. but it's
atheism is just easier.
Yeah, sure.
And actually with my publisher, we did go back and forth on the book title.
Okay.
He's like, because he knows my definition of atheism. He's like, well, are we going to cut out all the other types of free thinkers? And I'm like, I'm going with it's one word. It still gets people's ears perked up.
Yeah.
I like it. So that's what we decided to go with.
What I like also is when you mentioned cosmos and the sort of the wonders of the universe and the open-mindedness. And Thomas Berry, I don't know if you know him, he's the environmental thinker, very accessible writer. He talks about how human beings need to get rid of the old story, which is the, in a sense, what atheism is trying to do. The old story, the old narrative of what humanity is and so forth, and come to a new story, one that is built on the wonders that science has shown to us through cosmology and evolutionary biology and so on. But he's still sort of carving a space for the human in that as one of the expressions of consciousness in the universe. He doesn't mention the animals as much, but what I've taken him to mean is that because they're sentient, they're also expressions of the consciousness of the universe, just as much as we are, because of course we're animals, right?
Yeah.
So it would be illogical to say that they weren't. And it's a wondrous concept to think that way. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that idea, especially with your greater inclusion of non-human animals. And I think a previous question you asked factors into that very well, which is part of this thirst we have for knowledge of the cosmos also, goes in non-scientific directions. I mean, I'm a humanities person, and I think there's a somewhat recently deceased author, Victor Stenger, who wrote a book called New Atheism, and he talks about kind of misconceptions that, like, atheists don't have wonder about the world, that they don't appreciate the beauty of a work of art or the power of a poem or something like that. And that's, I think, where these idea of religious texts come in, where, I don't want to have a worldwide book burning, but I want to put them in what I see as a proper cultural context and learn from them as both history books in a sense, but also works of literature arising out of certain time periods that have then been revisioned by subsequent generations. So I definitely completely support that idea of this kind of sense of wonderment and appreciation for the things we don't know. I'm not of the mind that maybe science even can ever answer everything. I mean, again, being an anti-vivisection activist, highly critical of what science might have to do to find answers. Like the Russians sending dog to space for I know there's a little dog right there who you're petting and sending a dog to space knowing that this dog was going to die. And then years later, don't worry, you're not going to space. And then years later, saying that they really got attached. I don't think that was worth it. I honestly don't think that was worth space. It could have been done another way.
I totally agree. We have vivisection at University of Toronto, unfortunately, and 90,000 animals killed and tortured here a year.
All right, let's get a protest going. Bring the computer.
Yeah.
Bring the
Yeah, we should be doing that. Anyway, it's outrageous, but you're right. And I think just as we said there's multiple Christianities, multiple atheisms, I think there are multiple sciences. And I like Mark Beckhoff's idea that there should be a compassionate science.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, we should reject the unethical sciences such as vivisection that are not only scientifically questionable but ethically problematic, and we need to reject it on that basis. But at the same time, science has also provided us with some incredible knowledge that can awaken in us a sense of wonder that has historically been the domain of religion, right? And so
yes, and science and religion are really they're similar in some ways. There's a small group of people claiming to have knowledge of how the world works, and we're all supposed to believe them.
Exactly, yeah. That's interesting.
So they're not completely distinct. I find, I'm not, again, this isn't my original thought. There's some very interesting correlations between religion and science.
Absolutely.
They're not
Absolutely.
odd bedfellows necessarily.
I mean, even vivisections, the euphemism we use for killing is they sacrifice the animal.
For the greater good.
For the greater good, for science, yeah, literally. The field that supports what you're saying, as you might know, is the philosophy and sociology of science, which shows that it is a human endeavor, and that it's influenced by human prejudices. It has to be examined on that. It's not absolutely objectively true, and in the same way, religion is also a human endeavor and influenced by human prejudices. So they're similar in that sense. Well, both can be examined from a sociological perspective.
Yeah, nothing's neutral or apolitical.
Exactly, yeah. So does anybody else have a question or thought they want to ask him? We have a lot of interested people, but they're very shy.
So, are people here because they want to be, or is this an extra credit thing? A little bit of both?
Well, yeah, no, we don't. It's actually Animal Rights Academy is just a public lecture series, and it's not even for credit. It should be.
Wow, I'm so impressed. I love when people do things on college campuses that don't involve extra credit. So.
Yeah, no. This is actually, I don't think there's a single university student here. This is all from the animal rights movement, these people.
Oh.
Yeah, about 20 people, yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, a lot of us are involved in what's called the SAVE movement. You might have seen it on Facebook where they go to the slaughterhouse and stand in front of the trucks.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah,
good work.
Yeah, so
you
wanted to ask a question. Did humans make God or God made humans? Ian had a question. Ian's our resident fruitarian, and he said, did God make humans or humans make God?
I would say humans made God.
Okay. I knew you would say that.
We'll be on the fruitarianism. I don't think I could do it. I imagine it's hard in Toronto as well.
Oh, no, not at all, actually. If you go to Chinatown, it's amazingly easy and cheap. In fact, Ian always brings fruit to class. He's known for that.
Nice.
Okay, Carlos has one. Do you have one?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, Carlos, and that's probably the last one, I would imagine.
Okay.
Well, I would be interested in knowing your opinion on how an activist should talk about religion when doing activism. You seem to say that a Christian could not rely on the sacred text to give a better position for the animals as being more than they are portrayed in the books. You could not use the Bible or whatever other sacred text to back you up, or there is a question for interpretation. I'm a little bit confused on that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that's possible because, again, I've read just so many books that do it. I think some are much better than others. In an activist context, I think it would be very disingenuous of me as an atheist to try to make a argument from religion for animals, but I think you just have to be true to yourself. I'm not going to lie and pretend I'm a religion I'm not to persuade somebody. But if there's a Christian or a Muslim doing vegan outreach, or a Buddhist or a Jain, obviously they have a view of their religion that fosters more compassion than the mainstream view. So I think in that case, if it feels true to you, then it should be used as an activist. But I would say, don't be an atheist for one person, a Buddhist for another, and a Christian for another. I just gotta get everybody I can to agree with me. If I were, again, in that position, I would probably just say, I really can't answer that for you because I'm not of your faith, but maybe there's an activist over there who's Christian, or I would probably recommend, the Christian Vegetarian Association, which is something free they could go to online. I would say, there are people who think like you, and also think a little like me, and I would offer them resources. Yeah, I would never go into a diatribe about why they should be atheist or anything like that. I don't think it's hard enough trying to convince someone to not eat animal products. I have no delusions that I'm going to talk someone into being an atheist, and that's not really my goal either. So.
That was a good, valid point. Thank you. I consider myself an atheist, and on that attitude of trying to help animals, I would probably try to engage in conversations related to the religion that I don't believe. So it's probably better and wise to just recommend them to the organizations more related to.
Absolutely. I'm not the person to have that conversation with. Yeah.
Another thing that strikes me is that someone like Richard Dawkins can arrive at a conclusion favorable to the animals and yet not change.
It's extremely frustrating. I mentioned Sam Harris, The Moral Landscape, and he really mainly addresses other species in his footnote, in his endnotes, which tells you a lot. He's like Mr. Rationality extraordinaire, and his reason is actually, it's theoretically possible that someday a race of super beings would land on the Earth, at which point he would become a food source for them, and he would have to accept his lot as being a food source for aliens. That's Sam Harris, philosopher, neuroscientist. I don't agree with everything he says, but he's smart. I would want to sit down with him and say, if that's the best you can do, that is not even close to good enough. I've never had a chance to have that conversation with him. I thought it was just a really capricious thought experiment to justify it, and again, it has nothing to do with me. He did a podcast, and he was talking about how he wants to go vegan, and he was asking any vegan to send him emails with names of books that he had a concern about nutrition. So I'm like, okay, there's someone who's following through, because I didn't buy it when he wrote the becoming a food source for aliens was just too out there for me.
Isn't he the guy who debated Chomsky over?
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
His worldview seems to be predicated.
I heard Chomsky obliterated him. I don't know.
He did. Yeah. He took a sort of a pro-war position, and Chomsky took a kind of anti-war position. So it seems to me that ethically, he's got some serious problems there. He's not for nonviolence, essentially.
Yeah. Some of the new atheists, I use them because it was strategic. They have the most cultural capital, so I want to see what they're saying, so I can say something about that in my book. But they have the accusations of Islamophobia. Richard Dawkins has said very rude things about women. These people, they're not moral exemplars.
No.
Or ethical exemplars. But again, what's so frustrating is I want to say sometimes, did you read your own book? And why have you not followed your own guidelines?
Exactly, yeah. So it's not only a critique of religion here, we also have to do a critique of this new atheism with regard to the animal issue, yeah.
Otherwise, we're just going to have new gods and priests to tell us what to do, so.
Interesting. This is a very enlightening discussion. Victoria has one more question, and I think we'll wrap up.
Hi again.
Hi.
I was wondering if you could clarify this for me, but doesn't Richard Dawkins' wife study animal sentience or something really similar? Because I know Dawkins has said a lot of pro-animal rights stuff, but he doesn't commit to being a vegan, which is hypocritical.
I'm not sure about his wife, but he's an evolutionary biologist.
Yeah.
I know he himself has studied the lives of animals very closely, and if you hear him It's on YouTube. It's called The Genius of Darwin. Dawkins interviews Peter Singer.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah. And that's really telling. What, like, all of these kind of the cognitive dissonance I had mentioned, where Dawkins, very in a blasé way, just says to Singer, oh, you're more moral than I am because you don't eat animals, as if you can make that choice to be more moral. He comes up with really bad reasons.
And doesn't he tell Singer that he can't eat animals because of the way they taste or something like that?
And this is, again, Richard Dawkins, who obviously isn't afraid of insulting anyone.
Yeah.
His reason is like, oh, it's so much a part of our tradition and our culture that it's too, I don't want to give it up. It's like, so is religion. And
yeah,
you
exactly.
after it in the most vicious ways possible.
Exactly.
And I think what it comes down to is just, you know, a simple question of he doesn't want to give up his point on the top of the hierarchy that he claims doesn't exist.
That's really good. Yeah.
Wow.
We should have you debating, Doc.
Oh my gosh. That would be interesting. I might cry, so.
Great. I wanted to thank you for sharing your insights with us, and I realize you've written a book on this now that we should have actually got copies of and sold or something for you here, but maybe at another time you can come to Toronto live and do that. And
and if your interest is piqued, I'm very proud of the book for many reasons, one of which it's actually the cheapest book, like $20, but you can get it on Kindle for like $10 or something like that.
I certainly even get it and read it. It sounds great, and we really appreciate your sharing this. That's making the time.
Nice.
All right.
Thanks so much.